Eccoci, siamo online con l'edizione 2020 degli IVI Pro Days. Anche quest'anno, come l'anno scorso e l'anno prima, parleremo di videogiochi e del loro rapporto con il territorio e di come possono essere una risorsa preziosa per raccontare il territorio. Questa è la prima lecture, per cui anche per noi è un po' un esperimento andare online. Quest'anno siamo online a causa del Covid, quindi diciamo che faremo di necessità virtù. E come saranno strutturati questi IVI Pro Days? Innanzitutto, io sono Andrea Dressene, sono il presidente di IVI Pro, però ci tenevo a ringraziare anche coloro che qui non sono con me, ma hanno lavorato a questa edizione, quindi a partire da Stefano Caselli, che ci tengo a ringraziare, Matteo Lollini, Matteo Ridolfi, ma anche il prezioso aiuto di Valentina Paggiarin e di Antonio Giacomin, che di fatto ci hanno aiutato soprattutto a creare la virtual exhibition che vi invito a visitare. E ovviamente soprattutto un grande ringraziamento alla Regione Emilia-Romagna, senza la quale non saremo qui. Di fatto è grazie al loro sostegno che riusciamo a organizzare gli IVI Pro Days. Avremo delle lecture in diretta da qui a domenica, la prima è questa sera. Avremo anche delle interviste, due interviste, in quel caso registrate, che manderemo in onda venerdì e domenica. Avremo anche degli eventi speciali. Sabato avremo un evento speciale musicale dove faremo un omaggio all'intervallo Rai con il nostro intervallo IVI Pro, ovvero l'Italia nei videogiochi, musicata in live streaming da Luca Maria Baldini, che è un compositore e musicista. Quindi avremo un po' di eventi un po' differenti tra loro, ma sempre focalizzati sul rapporto tra videogiochi, territorio, patrimonio e turismo. Ecco, io vado velocissimo perché ci tenevo soprattutto a dare il benvenuto a Guillermo Vizcaino, che ovviamente in questo momento non sta capendo nulla di quello che sto dicendo, forse ha capito, ecco, che è il PR Director, Lead Writer e Video Producer della software house messicana Lienzo. Lienzo, che ha realizzato il videogioco Mulaka, un gioco incentrato sulla cultura messicana, in particolare sulla cultura dei Tarahumara, che sono una popolazione nativa del Messico del Nord. Quindi ecco, loro hanno lavorato per raccontare questa cultura all'interno del gioco, quindi raccontare la cultura, il folklore locale all'interno di un videogioco, ma mantenendo un equilibrio tra gioco e racconto del territorio, perché poi quello è l'importante, mantenere un equilibrio tra elemento culturale di racconto ed elemento ludico. Quindi adesso passo all'inglese per introdurre Guillermo. First of all, welcome to Italy. Even if in a virtual mode, it's like Italy virtual version. And thank you for accepting our invitation. And I'm really glad you are here to share with us your experience with Mulaka. That is an adventure game inspired, as I told before, in Italian by the Mexican culture and the Tarahumara civilization. So I give you the floor right now, so you can present yourself better than I did, because you know yourself better than me, and you know your game and your works. So thank you again, and welcome.
Awesome. No, thank you. And I do appreciate it a whole bunch. I got a little bit of that Italian, not enough. But I do appreciate everything. So thank you for having me. It's truly a pleasure to be here. And yeah, so without further ado, we can jump right straight into the presentation.
Okay. So I'm going to remove myself from the screen. I'm leaving the screen to you and your presentation, but I'm here. So, and I want to voglio another thing in Italian. Voglio ricordare a tutti che potete fare domande a Guillermo. E cioè alla fine della lecture avremo 15 minuti di Q&A, ma poi dopo anche il Q&A, chi vuole può incontrare Guillermo. You can meet the lecturer inside a virtual room. So I'm mixing Italian and English. It's very strange.
I noticed.
So if you want to have a chat with Guillermo after the lecture, we can meet inside the virtual room, and we are going to share the link at the end of this lecture. So Guillermo, I give you the floor.
Awesome. Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah, so before we truly get started, again, I want to thank a very heartfelt thank you to everyone at the event and the organizing committee and the Italian video game program. It's truly an honor for me to be here and to be, as Andrea will put it, virtually in Italy. So I'll try my Italian the best I can. Grazie a tutti. It's really a pleasure. So as I've been already introduced, but I'll give I'll talk a little bit about myself in depth. My name is Guillermo Vizcaino. I'm from Mexico, born and raised, and I worked as the head of PR and marketing, lead writer and video producer in a little studio we have in the northern part of Mexico. What I do in the studio is the following. As head of PR and marketing, I'm pretty much in charge of working with our partners externally. This could be anywhere from press to our community to platform holders, basically working on the relationship that we have with them, people like with Ivy Pro, of course, and universities and things like that. As a video producer, I'm in charge of creating basically video assets for the products that we have, mostly trailers, but also video documentaries or things like that, ads. And finally, as the lead writer, and probably the main reason why I'm here today and I'm able to talk about this set of topics with you, as a lead writer, I'm in charge of everything that goes into the game that touches a narrative and storytelling. And in particular, in this last game of ours, as we dive so much into cultural topics and cultural mythology and cultural heritage in a weird way that makes me the studio's head of research in some very vague sense. And I say vague because I don't consider myself and everyone in the studio a true expert on the topic, but we've been around long enough dealing with cultural aspects and the right way of handling them that we can give a good talk about how best to handle them when you're a developer working on, as Andrea well put it, games first, and then cultural inspirations in a way second. Not to say that they're less important, but when you make a game, you have to make the game the first most of aspects. And so I do work at a studio by the name of Lienzo, which is located in the northern part of Mexico. And as you can see, we're a very joyful bunch of fellas that all join in this passion journey of sorts in our dream of making games and doing things that really fill that creative void that we have inside of us. We are very passionate, and we do share a single ideology in terms of the following. We do believe that as a species, as humans, we do have one of our main traits that define us is a sense of exploration, right? We always want to have or discover knowledge in every realm. And the way we've done that in present times is by exploration, right? And we tend to, and we've seen it already, we go and we explore the depths of the ocean and see what's in there. We're out right now, we're going into the out reaches of space and seeing what's in there. And in the studio, we do believe that there is one more important place that we have to look for, where we can get some of the more amazing discoveries in terms of human knowledge and evolution. And that is not by looking to the outside, but rather looking into the inside. And what we mean by the inside is who we are as a species and what the many different cultures of the world can give us in terms of knowledge for us to grow, right? And so looking into the inside is what led us eventually to creating something like Mulaka. Mulaka is our latest title. And it's a 3D action adventure game that is totally centered around and inspired by the mythology of the Tarahumara or Raramuri Native American community in northern Mexico. In the game, you play as the titular Mulaka, who is a shaman or is a sukuruame, who is basically a shaman inside the community roles for the Tarahumara. What's special about the sukuruames is that they are an individual with a keen special bond to the spiritual world. They are able to connect with the spiritual world. And what we mean by that, and what the myths and the mythology means by that, is that they have a connection to not just spirits, and they're able to see and interact with them, but also the earthly demigods, and then by extension with the major gods, right? What they denominate as the ones above. And so in the game, you're tasked with meeting with these demigods and acquiring their blessing and rally them behind you in your cause to save and basically lead your people to salvation in a time where impending doom is coming. And so the way you do this is that you reach the demigods, and then the demigods bestow upon you the ability to transform into what their physical forms would be. And so throughout the game, you're able to turn into a variety of animals that you can then use for solving puzzles or for facing a variety of enemies, including, of course, what you're seeing on screen right now, which is the mighty Ganoko, right? This ancient anthropomorphic golem creature that's fearsome and one of the many great myths that the Tarahumara people have to offer. Now, I know that, of course, there's probably a lot to imagine, and I've talked nonstop for a little while. And we believe that in an audio-visual medium, it's always easier if we just go and show the audio and the visual, right? And so I'm going to share with you a little video that will tell you a little bit more about, or will allow you to see a little bit more about what the game goes and what makes it tick, in the form of a launch trailer, which I'm going to show with you right now. So here you go. If we can go full screen on this, it would be swell. All right, perfect. So that's basically what Mulaka is. You can immediately tell there's influences from a whole variety of games, mostly Zelda-like games. There's some Darksiders in there, and some would say that also a little bit of Dark Souls. But that's basically what we created, right, with Mulaka. Obviously, hugely inspired, and you probably saw a lot of different enemies and entities and locations that are all based on authentic Tarahumara myths and legends and locations as well. So that's what we did. And in order for me to tell you more about in depth what it is that we did and how we did it and how we think it's the best way of handling this type of cultural project, I have to jump briefly on the time machine and lead us back in time a little bit to the very beginnings of the studio. This used to be Lienzo back in the day when we were not as established. And so, brief history on Lienzo. We established the studio back in 2012. And what we did back then is we did client work, basically work for hire, to survive. So we did games for restaurants and games for museums, games for government events like book fairs and things like that. And we reached this point where we decided that we entered the video game industry with a dream of creating games like Mulaka. And we were not doing that, and we didn't do it for a couple of years. And so we decided to take a huge risk and go full independent, live behind client work, and start working on the type of games that we wanted to make, basically, which was, of course, extremely risky, and very vocally. We received a lot of not a lot of encouragement in terms of saying, well, you're in a literal and metaphorical barren, desert for development. This is probably not a good idea. And we thought, screw that, we're going to do it, and we want to do it. We're going to make it. And so we started working, and we went full independent. And when we reached that point, we decided, okay, so what it is that we're going to do, that it's going to be that one game that we make because we want to make it, and because we make it the way we like to play games. And we had two options. We had Grand Theft Rancho, or Grand Theft Ranch, which is our own version of Grand Theft Auto for our town, which was, of course, extremely out of scope. And we joked around the idea of making a Tarahumara Zelda. And originally it started like that. It started just like a joke, and we thought we said, like, oh, of course not, don't be stupid, right? And then we went away, and we kept thinking about it. And as we thought about it, we slept on the idea. Things started to click, and so we gathered around the next day, and we thought, you know what? Maybe that idea about the Taramura Zelda is not that bad after all. And so we started to do research, right? The research that led us to getting to know this amazing tribe and culture. Now, you probably don't know this, but it's extremely hard to make research on the Tarahumara because most of their cultural heritage is transmitted, and it's passed on from generation to generation via oral tradition. And so written depictions and written research on them, it's rare. But whatever there was, and that we started to read, turned this Taramura Zelda, eventually Mulaka, into more than just a game that we wanted to make. It turned into a game that we needed to make. And there's a very simple reason for that, because the Tarahumara not just are a fantastic tribe on its own, right? But they are also very ingrained into the roots of what makes us us, right? In the sense that we are very much intertwined with this tribe here in the northern part of Mexico, in this state in particular. And so we convinced ourselves that this was a game that we needed to make. Here are some of the findings that we found, and that we managed to amass as the time went on. Just to give you a little bit of an overview as to what the Tarahumara are, and some of the more interesting facts about them. Their population is estimated to be around 120,000 members. Now, this number, it's a little bit tricky because many of this number accounts for many of the descendants of the culture, which would mean that it's accounting for members that are already one step removed from the community itself, or from the more traditional communities. Maybe the daughters or granddaughters or grandsons of Tarahumara that are now living in the city and living a more globalized lifestyle. And those are accounted into this. But there's a certain balancing act to be done, because for censuses, and in this case, this is a census that was performed in 2006, I believe, it's extremely hard to really measure the amount, or really account for all of them, because many of these communities, the more traditional communities, are embedded into the very mountain ranges themselves, in the depths of the mountain ranges themselves. And so it's extremely hard to get a real accurate reading as to how many of them there are. But there's an estimation of about 120,000, which is a formidable number, especially for a Native American community, or a group that's been around since before the time of the conquest, right? And so this is one of the more ancient, yet very much still active groups of Native Americans in the continent. They speak primarily two languages: the Tarahumara traditional language, which is extremely important because, as I already mentioned before, most of their cultural heritage is passed on by the means of oral tradition. And so this is their main way of communicating who they are, their core values, and their traditions up to upcoming generations. Spanish, of course, is their second main language, as it's born out of necessity, right? Especially with communities that are in the surroundings or more heavily urban populations or more heavily urban areas in the state. And so Spanish is just a way that they have to communicate with the rest of the surrounding world. And then we go to religion, and religion is one of the more interesting aspects for these guys. There's three main ways of analyzing it, and it would depend on which snapshot in history you're looking for. If it's a little bit more in the past, or if it's a little bit more in the present, and from which way you're looking at it. So the main one, the first one, and the more important one is what we know, or what we coined as the Taramura Animism. Which is where most of the myths and legends that we're going to talk about during this talk came from. Animism, as you probably know already, is a broad term for accounting a specific type of religion which looks into the world and believes there's a certain amount or a certain degree of spiritual energy imbued into every living organism, or rather into every entity around you, right? This belief, then evolves into the belief that this spiritual energy that's around you, that it's inside of you, it's also inside of everything around you. It has a certain degree of divinity to it, and so everything around you, including yourself, is divine to a certain degree. And this in turn leads to a very naturalistic way of looking at life, a perspective of life where everything is sacred, and so you're bound to protecting it and you're bound to respect it. And so this is one of the main reasons why the Tarahumara are so environmental conscientious, or in pro natural laws and ways of thinking. Because again, they believe that everything has basically life in it, and not just life, it has some sort of divine life. And of course, it's not the same to say that a rock and a person, even though they both share a certain degree of the same type of energy, spiritual energy, there's of course more of it in living creatures and more complex creatures than it is in other things. But each of those entities deserve a certain amount of respect. And so from this arises an extremely complex view of the world that we coined as Taramura Animism. Then we have the Peyotism, which is again a very broad term, and I'm sorry that I have to really oversimplify this terms for the sake of time. Peyotism is a very broad term to describe most of the ways in which Native American ideologies and religions blended with Christianity or Christian views, mainly in the regions of Northern America. So Native American tribes in Canada, or Native American tribes in the US, and Native American tribes in Mexico follow this doctrine of hybridization with Christianity. That's labeled as Peyotism, and there's this church of Peyotism that some adhere more to than others. But it's just a general term to try and describe how traditional religions have blended with more modern Christian ways of seeing things and views. Peyote, which is the root word for this, Peyotism, it's an interesting one because it's a type of herbage that has psychedelic properties to it, and has been attributed by many of the religious Native American tribes throughout history a certain degree of divinity, given the effects that it produces. And especially for the Tarahumara, is one of the more important herbages out there. Peyote, it's considered one of the higher gods in terms of its ability to give you wisdom and give you answers to questions that you may not otherwise be able to get. It's the end stage of a pilgrimage journey, and so it's just interesting to see the parallels drawn between these terms. And finally, and the one that has the big asterisk next to it, is Roman Catholicism, or Roman Catholic. As you probably know, Roman Catholicism is the prevalent religion in Mexico, and so many of the Native American communities, including the Tarahumara, have adhered to this sense of Roman Catholicism. If you were to ask someone, especially if it's close to a urban hub, what the religion was, they would say they were Catholic. But as we've very interestingly be able to notice when we did work, especially in tandem with anthropologists, we realized, and this is what we were told, that this Roman Catholic views are only laid on a very superficial level. And why is it a superficial layer? Well, the way that they describe it, and I really love the explanation, is that if you start to scratch away at the surface, you're very, very quickly noticed that there is a continuation, there's a continuum in the way that these tribes have been worshiping their own deities. In the case of the Tarahumara, the All Mother Sun and the All Father Moon, along with the other celestial bodies. And they have just extrapolated the same types of beliefs and renamed them in a way to adhere to a more traditional Christian way of looking at things. But their rituals themselves, if you go to a Tarahumara Mass or you go to an Easter celebration, that it's traditionally a Judeo-Christian belief or celebration in origin, is extremely different from what it would be in anywhere else in the world, because they are still honoring these deities the way they've done it for thousands of years. And so once you start scratching, you realize that, God and in turn Jesus, it's just a substitution for the All Father, the Moon All Father, and the Virgin Mary, or in the particular case of Mexico, Virgin of Guadalupe, which is just a remorphation of the Virgin Mary herself. It's the All Mother Moon, and so the way that they honor them is just the same. And so it's just a very superficial way of having a Roman Catholic view, whilst not really having a Roman Catholic view, which is a very interesting process in on itself. And so moving on with what's interesting about them, this is, as I already mentioned before, this is one of the most ancient, active Native American groups and communities that we have today in the world. And it's extremely interesting because we have extremely traditional communities still living in traditional ways deep into the mountains. But their traditions go all the way back to not just pre-Columbine times, but really, really ancient times. This is what's called the Cueva de las Monas, which is it's a cave located nearby the center, the capital city of Chihuahua here in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, where we found a series of cave paintings dating back centuries that depict the same stories that we are telling right now with the Tarahumara lore. Not to say that this were Tarahumara per se, but some sense of ancestry can be easily drawn between whoever did these drawings and the present day Tarahumara, which is extremely fascinating to see in terms of having a community that's transcended time in such a manner, and that's still very much active to this day, even if they are in a way becoming more globalized as time goes on. So a little bit about where to find them. Here you can see the yellow outlined state of Chihuahua, which is the state or the province that we are the studio is located, the studio is based on, and where the Tarahumara are mainly located. There's a certain portion to the western side of the state that's where the main western Mexican mountain range crosses by, which is called the Sierra Tarahumara, and this is a mountain range that goes up north into the United States, and it's known as the Rocky Mountains up there. So the Rocky Mountains in here are Sierra Tarahumara. It's a huge mountain range where these communities are mainly located and centered. And you'll see the reason that we decided to really explore them in depth is that they're very much, as I said at the beginning, ingrained into the local, not just folklore, but the local core root of what makes us in the state. This is, I don't know if you guys have this in Italy, but each state or each province has a shield of its own that's meant to represent what the main values and the main core aspects of each individual province is. This is the Chihuahua state shield. And as you can see, and this is an illustration it's been updated, but it's been long standing for decades over decades. One of the main things that you can find in the shield is the presence of a Tarahumara Native American meeting a Spaniard conqueror, surrounded by what makes the city well known, which is the cathedral, the aqueduct, and the values of bravery, loyalty, and hospitality, which is what you can see around the shield and the red portion. So it was interesting to see that, this value for the Tarahumara tribe has been ingrained in the state's history for a very, very long time, and it's worth mentioning. And so we arrived finally at this stage after all of that research was done, where we knew one thing. That's the reason why they're well known is because they're amazing runners, right? They're known around the world because they run marathons in cities all over the globe, and even beyond that, they run other marathons in their home state in mountain ranges with essentially rubber slippers, and so they're considered in that regard, in that sense, basically superhuman. And that is what they are known for in the world. And then we discovered that it's not just that, it's also this entire cultural heritage that they carry behind them that makes them very interesting. And we wanted to showcase that, not just why they're known physically, but also why they should be known in the realm of mythology and cosmovision. And finally, we arrive at now the game, right? Everything I told you about this has been our initial research for them. Then we arrive at actually becoming or transforming all of this into a game. And for this, we created, or we envisioned a set of 3 different pillars that we believe applies maybe not to every cultural game, but for most cultural inspired games out there. And we divide it into 3 different categories, which points to touch on each one of them. The first one is permissions and involvement. Where you go and pitch the ideas, you obviously touch on representation. You have a reach a consensus with whatever it is that you're taking inspiration from. In this case, the Tarahumara, but it could be any other Native American tribe or any other Native American or non-Native American, just indigenous topic. Make it both ways so that it becomes a product that's property of both the studio and the tribe or the thing that you're taking inspiration from, getting them involved in the process and incorporating their objectives. And we're going to see all of this in more detail with Mulaka as an example in a little while. Then the gathering of materials, and this is where you're going to get everything that you need to actually put in the game, which includes, of course, scouting for whatever it is, if you're going to put real locations in the game, conceptualization, study of flora and fauna, which is extremely important if you want to make your world believable to the location that you're actually depicting, establishing connections that perdure during the entirety of production with the community, and the obtention, this is the most important part, the obtention of the stories, the myths, and the legends that you're going to be using in the game. And finally, the stillment and the curation of all of those things that you already obtained, right? The stories, the myths, the legends. For this, you have to approach experts that are actual experts in the topic. Because I said, right, we don't consider us at the studio to be experts on anything relating to the Tarahumara. The curation of this material, so you get the core mythology of what you're working on and not any influence from external factors. The discussion about appropriateness and of the thematic that you're going to be touching on, or you want to step on anyone's toes, and make this, as well as the connection you have with the community, an ongoing process through the entirety of the development of whatever game is that you're making. So the first step for Mulaka, permissions and involvement. When we set out to make the game, the first thing that we needed to do was to reach out to cultural leaders, to governesses and governors, to social leaders within the Tarahumara community, in order to get first the permissions to make the game itself. And this, in a way, became us pitching to the communities what it is that we wanted to do and why we wanted to do it. And in the particular case of the Tarahumara, it became an extremely difficult challenge because, unlike other Native American groups out there, or communities out there, there is not a council that represents the entirety of the community, or the variety of different communities that all adhere to the Tarahumara essence. So they're all unique and divided, not fractured, but separated communities that each has its own hierarchy, its own leaders, its own council, its own elders, that we needed to approach in order to get a consensus from all of them into what it is that we wanted to make with the game, and how we wanted to portray it. This also became a conversation about, and this is what's important about this step, a conversation about what problems or what hurts these communities in terms of what it is that we can do, or how we could help in terms of alleviating some of these problems. In the case of the Tarahumara, and this is why I have these pictures in particular, the governors of this particular community told us that the one thing that they were more worried about was two things. Was how the original Tarahumara language was being lost, right? As time went on, and as globalization eroded into their traditions, their original traditional language was starting to become obsolete, and now people only spoke in Spanish, and the new generations had no interest in learning the Tarahumara traditional language. And so there was an interest for having some sort of language preservation embedded into this product that we were creating. That was the first thing that we learned about this, and that we were tasked with taking care of in some manner or some sense. The second one was that they saw this opportunity as video games for attacking the newer generations in terms of providing them with something of interest, or something that could be tailored towards them, for getting what they were no longer getting via oral tradition, which is an approach to their roots, their customs, their traditions, and their beliefs. Establishing that connection, and then making that connection perdure through the entirety of production, was an important part of how to handle these cultural topics the right way, respectfully and authentically. Now we get to the second pillar, which is gathering of materials. First thing, and the easiest one, was to actually scout the locations, right? Going into the Sierra Tarahumara, seeing the locations that we thought were interesting, were important, that were in a way that could provide a landmark for people to make the connection about where this is, and that this are places that exist and that you can actually visit. Going and knowing and learning about the flora, the fauna of each of these locations, as I believe it's important to get those things right if you really want to make the case for whatever product you're making to be authentic. Having authentic content within it, content that would make sense for it to be there, the type of trees that you have, the type of animals that you have, always helps sell the experience as a more authentic experience. Of course, conceptualizing in location and getting the ideas fresh from the actual scouting that we were doing. The first discussions as to how we can create original, interesting gaming ideas from what we were seeing that was a part of these places. And the more important part of all, the stories and myths that, as I already mentioned a couple times, most are obtained via oral tradition. And thus, the only real way in our minds to really get a hold of this stories from the source was to talk to the community and talk with members of the Tarahumara tribe, and really get from them these stories and these myths and these legends, trying to amass a library of potential stories that we can then use within the game itself, which was an extenuating process, but one that we believe is very much the core essence of what made Mulaka Mulaka. And finally, the stillman and curation. And this was a secondary and ongoing challenge, as we had to work very closely with actual cultural experts that could help us do something that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. And in this case, we worked with the now late Enrique Servin, which was a fantastic anthropology oriented mind that helped us take away all of the Spaniard influence, the church's influence, and the globalization influence out of this myths and legends. So we would just we could just keep the most core Tarahumara stories, and from that put in the game. And that was our way of really representing the authentic myths and legends of what made these guys such a fantastic culture, without anything to do with colonization or conquest or religious views outside of their own. That's the third and final step. And so that's absolutely everything that I've said about this research in particular. It's absolutely everything in pre-production. Now you actually have to sit and make the actual game, which is a whole lot of a whole series in on itself, and it would take us another conference to really get into the challenges of game development. But well, that's not the focus of this. But at this point, we were just finishing pre-production, and it was now time to start production. The one thing that I will say about it is that, and I think I already mentioned this twice, it was important that even during this next step of actually sitting down and making the game in front of the computer, we kept the conversations going with the tribe and with the anthropologist in order to keep refining each and every idea, so that we would always remain as authentic as we possibly could without delving too much into fiction, and retaining as much as we could of the original ideas from for the game that were directly coming from that source material that is 100% Tarahumara. And that way we were able to then create, something that started or originated in the real world, and transform it into a virtual recreation of itself, something that's real turned digital. And that is something that we are extremely proud of, creating these spaces and these locations based on actual real things, and then coming back to the communities and showing them and seeing how they recognize certain things, or they would understand immediately what we were going with this, or where we were playing this. And that's probably one of the more rewarding things that we got from working in Mulaka. The one thing that's, ironically, the only thing that's not taken from the original culture was our main character himself. Mulaka is the only part of the game, albeit it's of course one of the most important parts of the game, but it's the only part of the game that came from our minds. It's completely fictional. It was our, how to put it, it was a necessity. It was born out of the necessity of finding a way to link together every other single myth that we had in the game. The story of Mulaka as the savior of the community, as the Sukuruame who is tasked with facing off against these evil forces that are threatening your land and your community. That's all fictional, and it serves as the vehicle for us to take the player in this journey of interacting with every other single myth that we had in there that was authentic. Now, briefly, I just want to touch on a few of the myths and legends that we were able to extract, just because I think they're hugely interesting and entertaining. And seeing as we have about 7 minutes to go through them, I won't stay too much on each one of them. This myth that I'm about to show you, they're all in the game, and they're all part, core essence of what makes Mulaka, and how it's a good example of how we maintain that authenticity in an entertainment product, whilst keeping it fun in terms of a narrative that's ludocentric. First of all, the myth of Genesis, which is an extremely interesting one. The Taramura believe in this cosmovision of theirs that they came from the stars, and that when things originated, when things started, they fell from the sky and into the ground, already made, already as men, already as women. And once they rose through their dancing, they were able to create life all around them. Everything guided and following the doctrines of those above, which are the sun, or the All Mother Sun, and the All Father Moon, along with the dawn and the dusk, right? So all of the stages of the solar journey are in on itself, including the moon. The major deities that are always looking down on humanity, seeing and judging their creation. They have this very Nordic, not inspired, of course. They're completely separate cultures, but in essence, very very Nordic similar theory or myth that every now and then the world is destroyed and starts anew, right? In a similar fashion to what Ragnarok would be. The gods above would look at their creation, they would see that things are not as they should be, and so they would clean the slate and start anew. And these destructions were done in different manners. It could be heavy rains, it could be fires, it could be earthquakes, it could be hurricanes, it could be a variety of things. And this cyclic myth is something that we use in Mulaka as our excuse for guiding the players towards the end, right? You're facing the next world destruction, and so Mulaka is tasked with this huge mission of reaching the gods above and convincing them that the Tarahumara people are worth saving, right? And the world is worth saving, and that corruption is not absolute. And so you're in this journey in what would be the fourth cycle of this set of destructions to stop it and to try and avoid it. According to the nowadays the mythology we have today, we're living in the seventh iteration of this cycle, and the game takes place on the fourth. We did that so we have some distance and some creative liberty as for what we could have and what we could show, and have an explanation for why there was no other known threats as the Spaniards or the church or things like that. And that allows us to tell a self-contained story within this destruction cycle that's very, very interesting. We have, of course, interesting locations like Samalayuca, where, as I believe I mentioned, they go to this desert. This is, by the way, the desert where they filmed the original Dune film, the Samalayuca Desert in the northern part of the Chihuahua state. And they would go on journeys of pilgrimage, looking for Hikuli, who is the peyote god, looking for wisdom. And so we included this as the first level of the game is you looking for that wisdom as to what it is that's going on in the world and how to solve it. The way that you solve it, you learn how to solve it, is through the demigods. And I already talked about them a little bit. The demigods are animals, are the figure of animals, but ultimately gods that will help you in your mission and help the Tarahumara through mythology in a variety of ways. The wisdom of the deer is the deer itself is who taught the Taramura how to speak, how to dance. The Royal Woodpecker, which is an extinct species of the woodpecker there on top, is who carved the valleys and the rivers and like everything that's carved into the ground. He carved it. Down to the right, the serpent, the river snake, is linked heavily to water, and so from its maws, all the water in the world comes from. And if you saw the waterfall that I showed earlier, they believe that, Bawisini, who is the serpent, it's there on top with his maw open, and all of the water of the world comes out of it. And this very visually stunning image that they created for explaining waterfalls and water. The bear it's basically related to strength, and is who amassed the actual earth and gave it form and shaped it so that it's habitable. And on the far left, the puma, it's a light bringer, and his tail is always on fire. And so it's a metaphorical and a literal light that guides you out of whenever you're lost. It guides you out of the woods as this guiding entity that has, of course, a huge importance for the Taramura. All of these deities you can find in the game, you interact with in the game, and you can transform into in the game. And finally, the gods above, the All-Father and the All-Mother, who created everything and who are tasked with destroying everything once things don't go as they should. The maximum deities, and who I told you earlier are nowadays just superficially transformed into more traditional Judeo-Christian entities or characters, just to satiate or to adapt to a more modern view of the world, but still very much worshipped as they used to be worshipped back in the day, which is anthropologically an extremely interesting way of adapting and in a way, avoiding religious conquest. And that's it. That's how we make Mulaka. That's basically the process to which we arrive to create a game like this. Now I would love to know if you have any questions, if you'd like to know anything more about anything of what I just said, or beyond this too as well.
Sorry, I muted my microphone, and now I'm online. Thank you very much for your lecture. Very, very, very interesting. So I'm very glad that you opened this EV Pro Days 2020 edition. We have some questions. And I'm going to put them on screen because we can do it. And I don't know how it's going to look on the screen, but we can try. This is the first one. So we are going to be. We are. Yes, we have to.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So Claudio asked, but I think that the first that you have already answered to the first one. Have you had the opportunity to see the reaction from the Tarahumara during the development of the game? I think that you have already answered this question. But I think that the second one is particularly interesting and also maybe a difficult question, but we can try. Animism is probably the most difficult concept of all to convey because it implies a systemic view of life and not an individual one. Given that traditional video games need to keep the player at the center of the action, do you think it is possible to talk about animism with this medium? And the game is fun and cool. Okay, that's
awesome. So on the first part of the question, yes, yeah, it was a very important part of the production process to keep, again, right, the Taramura community as part of the production iterations that we were creating. We approached them approximately 2 or 3 times a year during our 2.5 years production timeline or time frame. And we would always try and bring with us a build of the game, or at least some way of showing the game. We did, and I believe I mentioned that it was one of the more rewarding experiences that we could have, was seeing some of this, especially the elders who were not as in tune with the whole video game and what is video game and all of this like new mediums type of entertainment media things, recognized from what he was seeing some of these legends, right? And I remember this one time that we were showing this fella where we were working on. He was like, without us saying anything, like, "Oh, that's Aganoko, right?" And we were like, "Holy shit, yeah, that's Aganoko. That's all right." And that's really, really special for us because, again, right, most of this is oral tradition. There are no depictions of anything of what you see in the game visually or painted anywhere, or it's just descriptions. And so getting that sense of reaction, that recognition just by looking at something that we interpreted, it's extremely rewarding. And yeah, no, definitely we made a point to come back after the game was over to show what we did on a Nintendo Switch, which is like the easier way of taking things, on the go. So we thank Nintendo for that, giving us the opportunity to do that. And the second part of the question, it's an extremely good question, and it is indeed animism in on itself, an extremely complex and difficult to convey term just in general, but then to try and bring it down to video games and a way for showing them, it's hard indeed. But I think the way we did it is that we approached our main character, which is not something I would generally recommend for development in general, but our main character is basically a blank slate approach, which means he or she has very little personality or personality traits to really speak of. He's more of a blank slate for you to put yourself in there and empathize, the way that Link works in the Legend of Zelda games, but maybe not the last one, but each other Zelda game out there is like, oh, Link is very much a blank slate for you to transform into the main character. And so that way of removing the humanity, if you want to see it that way, from that main character that you're playing with throughout the game, is a good way and then using everything around you to really try and convey that idea of, even if it's very direct, right? Like having characters actually interact with you in a sense that conveys that idea of everything being divine and everything being imbued with a certain spirituality and spiritual essence, is the best way that I can think of trying to convey that. Maybe something that's a little bit more experimental and less traditionally gaming would be a better way of doing it. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough trying to balance those two out, because again, it's about definitely portraying what we want to portray with the culture, but also keeping it traditionally a game and being gamey and being able to have gamey systems that are first entertaining and then educational, right? So it's always a balancing act. And thank you for liking the game. It's like a third question that I appreciate that.
There's another long question made by my colleague Stefano, so I'm going to put it on the screen. Okay, like the one before, we have to. Okay, I guess that one of your main concerns as developers and writers would be that representing the culture of Tarahumara without any prejudice or cultural bias. Game narratives as well as gameplay mechanics are in a way influenced by Western culture or by the Japanese culture, for example. How did you manage to avoid hegemonic viewpoints, both for what concerns gameplay mechanics and game narratives or representation?
That's another very good question. It is indeed, although I would still argue that in the side of game mechanics, there is definitely a very Western or ironically, a very Oriental influence to them. But I don't believe that mechanics in on itself are constitute necessarily an issue in terms of hegemonization of how we want to show the culture itself. Like I put it in two different realms in terms of we have game mechanics that are in a way just a tool, right? It's a tool like anything else that we use to convey a certain type of ideas, and indeed it's heavily based on other Western properties. But we also try to maintain those game-centric aspects as distanced as possible from the more culturally inspired narratives that we were touching on with the game. In a way of saying that you could look at Mulaka in two different ways. You could look at the Mulaka in the cultural centric aspect, and you can look at Mulaka as the game Mulaka, and you can analyze each one of them separately, creating a balance between those. It's very mechanical. It's not so much ideological, and so I think that's the way that I know it's very much a non-answer, but it's the way that we tackled it. Just looking at it from two different perspectives, so that those who are interested in the cultural part can just focus on that without really being affected by whatever it is that you're actually doing. What's the jumping and the surviving and the dancing and all of that. There are certain mechanics, though, now that I mentioned dancing, that we try to imbue with as much Tarahumara centric aspects as we could. Life replenishing, and even the way that life system works is based on actual myths, right? Tarahumara believed that men had 3 souls, that women have 4 souls, and each one of those souls is how we handle the game bar mechanic, which is a Western type of seeing things, right? The hearts in Zelda or the whatever bar in any other game. We divide it into 3, trying to make an homage to this. Okay, so you have 3 souls. And the way that you get them back, instead of just saying, okay, take a potion and that's it, it's that you have to dance, right? And that's one of the key things that we've been criticized for, because you have to wait in order for you to get your life back. But it's an homage to how the ritualistic traditions of the Tarahumara would dictate something like that to happen, right? In order to regain one of your souls, to regain or to replenish part of your spiritual essence. That's again a concept we take from that animism. We force you to live it as you would have to live it if you were a part of the community of Taramura, right? And that's an important in dancing and ritualistic things. So that's one way that we managed to marry both the core game mechanics with the inspirations. But it's tough to really get a balance on everything across the board.
Yes. I think that we have time for another question. I'm going to ask you something. Meanwhile, I'm speaking in Italian now. Se volete parlare con Guillermo dopo la lecture, c'è il link disponibile su Facebook e sarà a breve disponibile anche su YouTube, il link per accedere alla stanza virtuale dove appunto chiacchierare informalmente con Guillermo dopo la lecture. One last question about the soundtrack. How did you work with the music of Mulaka?
The soundtrack was interesting. I didn't do it personally, but our musicians, they went on board about achieving a connection to whatever members of the community that had some sort of musical proclivity, and from that sprung a variety of things. The first one was, of course, that connection allows us to kind of gauge and get an idea of how traditional composition for the Tarahumara musical world works. And second, it gave us some sort of an introduction to traditional instruments, which was mostly the way that we translated the traditional Tarahumara folkloric music into the game. Composition is a little bit harder because traditional Tarahumara music, it's not apt for a game, right? There's a certain role that music plays in gaming that we couldn't really use traditional composition for. And so we discarded that idea to the most part. We adapted the musical instruments into a more traditional orchestral composition, so we could have something from the actual tribe be a part of this modern take on orchestral music for video games that were influenced or that draw a little bit from the Tarahumara by the means of their instruments. And so each one of these compositions have at least one traditional instrument, whether that's some sort of percussion or some sort of this weird layers of little guitars and things like that, to instruments that I don't even have a name for, that are just generally traditionally used as for music. There's these bottles that you kind of hit and they produce a very particular sound that you can hear in like our 7th level of the game, which you hear and you're like, oh right, that's different, that's foreign, that's something I don't understand, but that all work in tandem with the rest of the orchestra to bring about this more traditional gaming music. That's the way that we handle the music for the game.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that our time we have to close the lecture, and we can meet the public in this virtual room. So thank you again for your for accepting our invitation for the lecture. It was very interesting, and so thank you. And now I'm going to speak Italian again. So, ci vediamo, chi vuole può raggiungerci in questa stanza virtuale, ci sarà anche Guillermo, ci vediamo di là per una piccola chiacchierata informale, e chi vuole può appunto unirsi a noi. E grazie a tutti, ci vediamo domani mattina per la prossima lecture con Konstantinos Dimopoulos, parleremo di città virtuali. Thank you again, Guillermo, and see you soon. Maybe in Italy, I hope.
hopefully, as soon as the pandemic is over. Thank you very much, everyone, you and the rest of the organization. It was a pleasure.
Buona serata a tutti. Ciao ciao.